It's Tuesday, October 21st, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Granthermes. Today on the show, millions of Americans turn out for the No Kings rallies across the country. We're going to talk about whether any of that actually matters in the end, and then we'll talk about how the White House and the president are responding to those protests and why that does matter. But first, make sure you're following or subscribe to the show on whatever podcast app you listen to it on. Like, subscribe, leave a comment below if you're a watcher on YouTube. Sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack for free or become a paid subscriber for bonus content for just $5 a month. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims Newspod. That's MIMS Newspod, all one word on every platform. I am at Granthermes on Twitter and Bluesky, and at Granthermes TV on everything else. All right, let's get to the show. You know, I've always got a cup of coffee next to me while I record these episodes. The studio is in the basement and it's kind of cold, especially as we head into the fall and winter here, but a good cup of coffee is one of those small pleasures which I think we could all use right now. It's why today's episode is sponsored by Afuera Coffee. Afuera Coffee takes your coffee experience to the next level with their specialty, hand-selected beans sourced directly from sustainable, certified Rainforest Alliance farms in Central and South America. Rich, volcanic soils infuse each batch with unique, vibrant flavors. Afuera Coffee's commitment to excellence starts at the farm, where they work closely with local farmers practicing ethical and sustainable methods. Whether you prefer a bold espresso or a silky smooth light roast, their versatile range caters to all tastes. Now, I tend to go with a lighter roast in the morning and then switch to an espresso in the afternoon, but however you manage your own crippling caffeine addiction is, up to you. All Afuera materials, from coffee bags to mailers and postage, are either compostable or recyclable, and 5% of all sales go to conservation charities, which is obviously pretty cool. And right now, you can get 15% off your entire order with the code MIMS25. That's MIMS25 for their best discount offer right now, and you can only get it from Make It Make Sense. The podcast does get a cut of some of that, but honestly, it'll just go right back into ordering more coffee, so you'll be helping me stay awake to make even more things make sense. Again, that is MIMS25 at checkout at afueracoffee.com. That's AFUERA.com. Taste the excellence with every sip with Afuera Coffee. All right, let's get on with the show. Over the weekend, more than 2,600 No Kings rallies were held in cities and suburbs around the country. The estimates right now were somewhere between 5 and 7 million people came out to protest against the administration's shift towards authoritarianism. Now, despite what's being said by right-wing commentators and Republican leaders, especially last week, that No Kings was full of Antifa or was going to be chaos, which is what Texas Governor Greg Abbott suggested before he mobilized what's left of his state's National Guard in Texas's own borders to patrol those protests, the protests were incredibly peaceful and there were very few protest-related arrests. And most of those arrests were actually of counter-protesters or pro-Trump bystanders, including one woman in Myrtle Beach who flashed her gun at protesters from her car, a 19-year-old in Nashville who brandished his gun at protesters, and a man who pointed a gun at protesters in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, who is now being charged with making terroristic threats. But overall, like I said, arrests in general were very low. Case in point, at one of the largest marches over the weekend in New York City, NYPD said out of an estimated 100,000 people who attended, not a single arrest was made. I mean, that's more people than attend most college football games. And you know that outside every one of those, there's at least one underage sorority girl trying to smuggle pocket shots in her bra getting arrested. And, Emily was just trying to have a good time, not protest against dictatorship. But anyway, if the estimated numbers hold, this weekend's No Kings protest will be the largest day of demonstration in more than 50 years since 20 million Americans turned up to support the very first Earth Day back in 1970. But the question now is, what does it matter that millions of people took to the streets? The answer depends on how you look at it and what you're trying to measure. So, for starters, there's a really prominent idea about political movements against governments called the 3.5% rule, which you might have heard that no government has withstood a challenge from 3.5% of its population. Now, that's not entirely true. The rule was developed by Harvard researchers to explain the threshold for when political protesters go from just being marches to being effective enough to win or, in some cases, topple governing regimes or oust governing officials. These researchers looked at more than 300 nonviolent political uprisings over the course of decades. And what they found is that when political movements mobilized with at least 3.5% of the population at their peak, or at a single time is what that means, they came out on top 89% of the time. Now, the researchers behind this say this is a rule, not a law, like a rule of thumb instead of a statistical or political science law, but it is a useful way to look at recent protests. Now, in the U.S., 3.5% is around 12 million people, so this past weekend's No Kings marches fall well short of that. So if your way of looking at these protests was to create immediate change, you're not going to find that here. However, there has been a ton of research on what happens below that 3.5% rule. And what researchers have found is that mass protests are really effective at getting support from a broader group of people, getting support from people with money and power, and they've been effective in mobilizing people to keep getting out to support at other rallies or at the ballot box. But maybe more importantly, mass protests play into our bias towards crowds as people. During the last 3 presidential elections, there was a lot of talk about crowd size at rallies being an important indicator of broad support for one candidate or another. It's one of Donald Trump's favorite topics, and infamously, in 2017, he lied about the size of his inaugural crowd. But broadly, people tend to overestimate support for something when they see a large crowd, and we also tend to trust the opinion of crowds because it seems overwhelming to have an opinion that differs from a mass group of people that big. Cornell researchers even found that that's true online when you come up against online mobs as well. All that is to say that people who might be inclined to already believe some of the things that No Kings protesters were talking about, but might have been reluctant to join or say those things out loud, may very well have looked at those crowds this weekend and said, that's a lot of people. Maybe it's safe for me to step forward. And researchers for decades have noted that's a crucial way that things like the civil rights movement and even the Tea Party movement in the early 2010s on the right ended up as success stories. Now, finally, there are the people who just wanted No Kings to get under Trump's skin. And when you look at it that way, it definitely worked. Because over the weekend, Trump was clearly irritated and then made the rest of the White House staff be irritated with him. First, he reposted an AI video of him in a fighter jet with the words King Trump written on the side. He's in the cockpit wearing a crown while flying over American cities, which I think are supposed to be either Chicago or New York, but AI couldn't tell, before Trump then dropped literal poop on crowds of protesters. And then J.D. Vance posted an AI video of Trump holding a sword, in a crown, and being robed in a royal cape while images of Democratic leaders knelt in front of him. And then the official White House accounts posted an image of Trump and Vance wearing crowns in a framed portrait together above the image of Democratic House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries and Democratic Minority Leader in the Senate Chuck Schumer, both wearing sombreros, which is also this racist thing the White House has been doing, but the caption on that has been, "We're built different. Have a good night, everyone, crown emoji." And first of all, it's concerning the White House is into posting AI videos and images this much. It's one thing for politicians to post memes made by some social media staffer. It's another to produce fake images of the president as official communication, because all of that is technically recorded history. Second, the video of the U.S. president dropping poop on Americans to troll his political opponents should be met with disgust. And not because it involves turds, although gross, but because it is disrespectful to Americans exercising their freedom of speech. It's also disrespectful to the office of the president as a president for all Americans. Whether Trump likes that idea or not, he still is that. And third, and most importantly, the United States is the United States because we rejected monarchy. And while Trump and Vance and the White House are trolling, it is and should be genuinely concerning that the most powerful person in the country, potentially the world, continues to talk about and show himself as a supreme leader with unchecked power. Our most fundamental, our most basic idea of what America is that we're governed by people elected by the people, not by kings or dictators. And these images are direct attempts to undermine that. And they force Republicans into some tricky situations. Here's Speaker of the House Mike Johnson answering questions about whether he has concerns about Trump depicting himself as a king. Here's what he said in two separate answers, and I've just stuck them both together here.
Senator Johnson, you say that the Democrats had a Hate America rally, but what does it say that the President of the United States over the weekend released a video of him pooping on the American people?
The President uses social media to make a point. You can argue he's probably the most effective person who's ever used social media for that. He is using satire to make a point over and over. Was if President Trump was a king, the government would be open. If President Trump was a king, he would have closed the national parks and the National Mall, so they couldn't have had the rally out here. By the way, that's what President Obama did during the shutdown in 2013, closed all the parks and the National Mall.
Yeah, okay. Satire isn't trolling, but I guess we can call that semantics or whatever. But Mike Johnson is the same guy here who constantly talks about the lack of decorum of Democrats, said that naked bike riders in Portland were a threat, and was videoed by a German media outlet in 2015 taking his 13-year-old daughter to a purity ball where daughters dressed up like brides in wedding dresses and then pledged sexual abstinence to their fathers in what looked like mock weddings to their fathers. But, Trump pooping on Americans isn't gross. It's expert social media use. But really, it's the second thing that's worth talking about here, because the government is shut down right now under a government fully controlled by Trump. This is as close to a king as a president can get, having power over the White House, the House, and the Senate. And the negotiating power is up to him. Leadership is the price you pay for winning the majority. It's something that I have said on this show before. And Trump and the GOP have refused to take that on. So just because Trump didn't shut down national parks when he could have doesn't mean that he's not playing the petulant dictator. In fact, it might prove the opposite. Now, in the real world, not social media, Trump seems to be both irritated and energized by no kings. In a Fox News interview over the weekend, he said he was still thinking about using the Insurrection Act in Chicago and other cities. Take a listen.
Don't forget, and I haven't used it, but don't forget, I can use the Insurrection Act. 50% of the presidents almost have used that. And that's unquestioned power. I choose not to. I'd rather do this.
It's not unquestioned power. It's broad, but it's not unquestioned. There are serious hurdles that Trump would have to jump before he can invoke the Insurrection Act, and he'd be met with even if he does. And as we've seen in Chicago and Portland up until this week, I'll talk about that in a second, judges haven't bought what the government is selling when it comes to putting troops on American streets. Also, for what it's worth, half of U.S. presidents have not invoked the Insurrection Act. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, it's more like 40% or maybe a little less, because some presidents like Andrew Jackson and Herbert Hoover invoked the Insurrection Act illegally. So if you don't want to count those because they didn't do it the right way, then that number drops. And what Trump is talking about doing, which is issuing a blanket, seemingly nationwide insurrection charge and then sending troops to whatever state he wants without that state's permission, that hasn't happened since 1965, when the state of Alabama was preventing law enforcement from carrying out desegregation laws. And the Insurrection Act hasn't been invoked, period, since the Rodney King riots in L.A. in 1992, when California asked for help from the first Bush administration. And what's happening in Chicago and Portland isn't like either of those situations, which is something that I've talked about before on the show, but really it's because ICE is still able to carry out high-profile raids and do large arrests without being impeded in any meaningful way. But the fact that Trump is still talking about it is something to pay attention to, because the more he talks about being this kind of unchecked president, the more used to that idea people are going to get, and that's how in the past Trump has turned unpopular ideas into ones that people just sort of shrug their shoulders at. And I promise this is going to come back to no kings here, but there is one more thing that we have to talk about, and that's that an appeals court ruled yesterday, on Monday, that federal troops from Texas can be sent into the city of Portland. The 3-judge panel ruled the administration could go ahead with its plan despite a previous judge, one appointed by Trump, saying the government didn't produce enough evidence that a rebellion was happening. And local officials on the ground have been saying for weeks now, if not months, that protests have died down in Portland since June, when they were pretty much at their peak this year. Now, to be clear, The idea of having troops on American streets is still extremely unpopular. In a new poll from Center Square, 60% of Americans said they did not want the National Guard called in to fight crime in their cities. 64% said they didn't want troops on their streets to quell protests or civil unrest. And 73% said troops shouldn't be called in to enforce immigration laws in sanctuary cities, which is what Trump wants to do in Portland and Chicago. The only time that people said they did want to see Guard troops in their neighborhoods was after natural or major disasters, which is where we normally see the National Guard called in. And that does get us back to no kings this weekend, because despite Trump joking, but not joking, that he's a king, saying that he's got unquestioned power and getting a first-of-its-kind win for him in Portland, those things are still really unpopular. And given what I said at the beginning, that people are swayed by large protests, the fallout from this past weekend's mass demonstrations will be an important space to watch. All right. That's it for today's episode. Please rate and review the show, whatever podcast app you listen to it on. Like, subscribe, leave a comment below, and hit the bell for notifications if you're a watcher on YouTube. Sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack for free, or to get access to bonus content is just $5 a month. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims Newspod. That's MIMS Newspod, all one word on every platform. I am at Granthermes on Twitter and Bluesky, and at Granthermes TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Granthermes, and I'll talk to you on Thursday.